This is the truth that no one wants to hear. You don't really own the ground you stand on. You don't have any say over the roads you drive on, the power lines that bring electricity to your home, or the hospitals you rely on. You have no say in how much you pay for a house, electricity, medical care, or even a loan, but you have to pay every month. Not to a medieval lord in a castle, but to a system that blocks access before you even get a chance to take advantage of it. This brings up a troubling question. When did our economy stop being modern and quietly turn back into feudalism? Money, power, and history all come together here, and believe me, things are not as simple as they seem. Most people think of knights in armor, stone castles, kings on thrones, and peasants chained to the land when they hear the word feudalism. It seems old, out of date, and long gone, an artifact that progress got rid of and the modern world threw away. But feudalism wasn't really about swords and royal titles. It was about who owned the productive assets. In the Middle Ages in Europe, land was everything. It was where your food came from. It was where your shelter was. It was important for your safety. It was necessary for your very survival. If you own the land, you own people's lives. If you didn't have land, you couldn't do much, no matter how hard you worked. The peasants weren't poor because they didn't want to work. They were stuck because they didn't have the one thing that really mattered. So they made plans that were dependable, predictable, and very unfair. Work to get permission to live. Loyalty in exchange for safety, paying to avoid starving. This wasn't chaos. This was structure. Feudalism worked because it got rid of doubt. Everyone knew where they stood in the chain of command. It was very rare for people to move up the ladder. The top kept most of the ownership. People also put more value on stability than on personal freedom. That's the part that modern history books conveniently leave out. Feudalism didn't go away because it was broken. It was thrown off because something else became more important than owning land for a while. That thing was money. The Industrial Revolution broke land's hold on human survival. Agricultural fields were replaced by factories. Cities took the place of rural estates. Paychecks took the place of feudal duties. And for the first time ever, people could make money without owning the asset that made it possible. This became the revolutionary promise of the modern economy. It didn't matter who owned the land. What mattered was having skills that people would pay for. You didn't need to inherit anything from your family. You needed to be able to work. You didn't need the approval of the nobility. You needed a job. It still mattered to own something, but it wasn't the only way. For a short time in history, being able to get to wages was enough. That window changed the course of human history. The 1800s and 1900s saw the rise of a huge middle class with rising incomes, more property ownership, and real chances to move up the economic ladder. This was something that had never happened before in history. Regular families could now own their own homes. Saving money actually did something. Workers had the ability to negotiate. Genuine but imperfect improvements in productivity led to better living standards. This time period taught many generations a dangerous lesson. They thought this was how things were supposed to be and that they would never change. But it wasn't a new normal that would last. It was an unusual event in history. Because even though land lost its most important role, ownership never lost its most important power. It just changed its look. Factories turned into multinational companies. Real estate became complicated financial products. Basic infrastructure turned into corporate balance sheets. And ownership began to concentrate again, slowly and almost without notice. Not by force of arms, but by how the market works. No troops marching, no orders from the king. No bad guys who twirl their mustaches, just the way economic incentives work. By the end of the 1900s, the basic rules had changed again. Capital moved around the world. Assets grew in value faster than paychecks did. Finance outdid real production. And getting the basics of life, housing, education, healthcare, and energy more and more required ongoing payments instead of full ownership. The old duties came back in new clothes. Not a pledge of loyalty, but a lot of debt. Not slave labor, but models that require a subscription. Not contracts for land, but payments for rent that last forever. The words became friendlier. The basic structure stayed the same. If we gave out awards for economic doublespeak, modern systems would win hands down. Because what came after feudal bondage wasn't real freedom. There were conditions on access. You can live anywhere you want as long as you can pay for it. You can move around as long as your credit score allows it. You can be a part of society as long as you can pay your bills. And unlike peasants in the Middle Ages, people today are always told that this is a way to gain power. Even if all the choices lead to the same place, having choices makes you feel free. This is where the comparison gets really bad. Brutality wasn't the main thing that made feudalism what it was. It was based on things you could never own. And you don't need castles from the Middle Ages to be dependent. It only needs that someone else owns the things that are necessary for survival. The farmer in the Middle Ages depended on land he would never own. The modern worker depends on things like housing, infrastructure, digital platforms, and financial systems that he will never own. Different ways of doing things. The same basic logic? Like feudalism in the past, today's system doesn't need bad intentions to stay stable. It just needs to be widely accepted. Because it was unfair, most people never fought against feudalism. They put up with it because there weren't any better options. That's the most important thing to get. It's almost never because of legal restrictions that people feel stuck in their jobs today. It's because of the prices. Because they no longer have the upper hand in negotiations. Because access has become conditional once more. Not by law, but by a slow change in the system. Before we talk about whether this is fair, long-lasting, or necessary, we need to understand how it happened. This system didn't just show up out of nowhere. It never said it was coming. It grew slowly and quietly. As ownership became more centralized, financial risk decreased, and keeping things stable became more important than making things easier to move around. Once you see that pattern, you can't ignore the historical parallels. Feudalism never really went away. It just got better at hiding. The system never said that strict class hierarchies would come back when ownership started to concentrate again. It didn't have to. Official announcements don't bring back hierarchies. They come back through pricing systems. The acceleration happened when the financial sector stopped helping the real economy and started changing it completely. As capital became more mobile, it became more profitable to own things than to make things. Housing was no longer just a place to sleep. It turned into a way to store wealth. Infrastructure was no longer only a public need. It turned into a chance to invest. Schooling was no longer just for getting ready for a job. It turned into a leveraged bet that was paid for in advance and paid back over the course of decades. As things changed, ownership moved further away from the people who really needed them. This is where the system finished changing in a quiet way. In a feudal economy, the key to getting rich was owning farmland. In an economy that is based on finance, wealth comes from owning assets that go up in value faster than wages do. The main idea is still the same. The only thing that changed was the tools. People who own assets that are worth more over time automatically gain economic power. People who depend on wages fall behind even when they do everything right. Productivity goes up, but the owner gets the benefits. The cost of living goes through the roof, but labor stays flexible. The system doesn't need to actively punish people who work hard. It just needs to give asset owners more rewards. And that's exactly what it does. Debt fills in the gaps. Not because the system broke down, but because it was meant to be that way. When wages can't keep up with the rise in asset prices, credit becomes the link between income and basic needs. Mortgages take the place of feudal land ownership. Student loans take the place of traditional apprenticeships. Credit cards take the place of savings accounts. Every duty is sold as a chance. Every payment is framed as a step forward. But debt does something subtle and strong. It ties the cost of work in the future to the cost of work in the past. A peasant in the Middle Ages had to work for land he would never own. A modern worker has to do work to pay off debts he has already made. Different words, same pull of gravity. This is why it seems harder to move up in the economy now. Not against the law, but limited in terms of money. You can move to different cities, change jobs, or even start over from scratch. But every year the cost of starting over goes up. If you miss a payment, The system will quickly remind you who has access. Nothing says freedom like having to ask for permission to live. A lot of people are pushing back at this point. They say that this comparison makes the case too strong, that modern life is not at all like feudalism, that no one is forced to comply, that there are still real chances. And, in a technical sense, they're right. There are no physical chains or legal bonds in Feudalism 2.0. It's about being dependent on structures. The serf in the Middle Ages couldn't leave because they needed land to live. The modern participant can leave without a doubt, but only if you give up access, getting into affordable housing, access to credit systems, access to healthcare facilities, access to any kind of stability. That's not direct force, it is conditioning of behavior. The system works perfectly because it doesn't feel too harsh. It feels completely normal. People don't plan protests against rising rents. They cut back on their spending. They don't question the rising value of assets. They go after returns on their investments. They don't question how much ownership there is. They think they aren't good enough. This shows how great modern hierarchy is. It doesn't require blind obedience. It sets up incentives to make sure people follow the rules. The system works exactly as it should when things get unstable, like when inflation rises, bubbles burst, or crises happen. First, it protects the value of assets. Money help goes up to the top. Losses are spread out across the bottom. Reinforcing the same structures that caused the imbalance in the first place temporarily restores stability. This would always win the gold medal if we gave medals for consistency in systems. Every intervention teaches the same thing. Protect ownership and manage dependence. I'm not making a moral judgment here. It's just seeing things as they are. And when you can clearly see this pattern, modern economic anxiety makes perfect sense. People aren't anxious because they're crazy or paranoid. They're worried because the economy has systematically turned against them. They feel like they're getting things done, but they also feel weak, working but open to danger, theoretically free but practically dependent. They know that just trying hard isn't enough to keep them safe anymore. That real security needs ownership that they can't get. That's not a sign of bad culture or character. There is a problem with the design of the structure. People didn't realize how unfair feudalism was all of a sudden, which is why it didn't fall apart. It fell apart when other systems spread ownership around enough to get rid of forced dependence. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If ownership keeps going up, dependency doesn't need to be enforced. It comes back on its own. Not through violence or conquest, but through spreadsheets and reports every 3 months. So the real question isn't if this system is fair. Fairness doesn't matter to economic systems. They react to structural incentives. The real question is whether any society can stay stable over time when most people are always involved but only own things for a short time. When they take on all the risk of loss but none of the chance of gain. When they rent their stability every month instead of making something that lasts. Stability without mobility eventually leads to stagnation. And historically, systems are most unstable when they don't change. This doesn't mean that total collapse is certain or unavoidable. It means that being aware is very important. It's not about giving up hope to understand Feudalism 2.0. It's all about getting clear. It's about understanding that freedom in the modern world isn't just a yes or no question. It exists on a scale that is affected by how much money you have, how much debt you have, and how easy it is to get resources. And the more you act like you own something, the stronger your economy becomes. Not because you're smarter or better by nature, but because the whole system was designed to protect ownership above all else. That's what history keeps teaching us over and over again. Power never goes away from human society. It simply rearranges itself into new shapes. And economic systems never really go away. They change and grow, bringing their old logic into new forms. When the walls of the castle fell down, feudalism didn't end. It came to an end when ownership spread widely throughout society. And it quietly came back when ownership was limited to a small group. Different time, different tech, the same basic mechanism. If this point of view changed how you think about the economy, click the subscribe button. History has all the answers, and I'll keep showing you how to find them.